All right, I will say good morning. Let us begin by thanking all of our sponsors for this morning share. To thank our TALMUD TORAH sponsors for the month of Tishrei, Sora Wolasky, in the zechus of refuah sheleimah for Zecharya Dov ben Perel Shira, Shaindy and Avraham Kelman, in memory of their beloved parents, and the zechus of all of those who need a refuah sheleimah. Dr. Linda Weinberg, in loving memory of her husband, Dr. Paul Weinberg, Peretz Moshe ben Avraham. Selma Woolf, with immense gratitude to Hashem, with Teffilos for health for all in the new year. And Leah Sol, as a zechus for refuah sheleimah for her daughter, Ilana Bas Esther, and for all those in need of yeshuos. We thank our Daf Yomi sponsors for today, Jacob and Julie Blumenfeld, with gratitude to Brian Neuman for being awesome. That's not my words; those are their words, which is great. What a beautiful beautiful dedication. Sponsor Daf Yomi in honor of someone being awesome. Okay, Baruch Hashem, halavai, we should all be zocha to receive such a dedication. All right, we'll say let's begin. A lot to do today. Baruch Hashem, an incredible daf ahead of us. So today's daf is Lamed Zayin 37, and we are picking up in Meretz Hashem on Lamed Vav Amud Beis 36b at the Mishnah. So the Mishnah says as follows: Kol mitzvah shitli baris. We'll say, so now, just so you understand and appreciate the theme, so after going through a number of mishnayos, a number of different discussions about mitzvos that men are obligated in, that women are obligated, or I should say the women are obligated, women are exempt, the Mishnah continues on this theme of creating different categories of mitzvos. So it says the Mishnah, Kol mitzvah shitluya ba'aretz, any mitzvah which is dependent on the land. Now we're going to define the exact nature of that statement, what that means. But any mitzvah that is dependent on the land, so the Mishnah writes, Eino nohages ela ba'aretz, only applies in Eretz Yisrael. The she'ina tluya ba'aretz, but any mitzvah that does not apply in the land or to the land, nohages bin ba'aretz bin b'chutz la'aretz, applies both in Eretz Yisrael as well as outside of Eretz Yisrael. Okay, like I said, we'll define exactly what this means in the Gemara. Top of Lamed Zayin, chutz min ha'arla, with the exception of arla. So let's remember again, arla is the prohibition to eat the fruits of a tree for the first 3 years after it's planted. So the Mishnah suggests that halacha l'maisa, arla applies in chutz la'aretz as well. Take a look at Rashi. Chutz min ha'arla va'kilayim. Kilayim refers to forbidden mixtures. Right, so remember again, the typical example of kilayim is like kilaya kerem, like planting grapes and wheat in close proximity, but it really represents again the intermingling of different species. Again, we'll get a little bit more into this in the Gemara as well. So we'll say, so here's what the Mishnah has just done. The Mishnah has created a category. There's something called mitzvos hataluyos ba'aretz, which are mitzvos which are dependent on the land. Again, that phrase still needs more specific definition, but mitzvos that apply to the land only apply in Eretz Yisrael, not in Chutz La'aretz. Mitzvos which don't apply to the land ultimately again apply in Eretz Yisrael and in Chutz La'aretz. Exception to the rule, arla and kilayim, which although again they are mitzvos related to the land, halacha l'maisa apply in Eretz Yisrael and outside of Eretz Yisrael, which means that, for example, outside of Eretz Yisrael, what the Mishnah seems to be saying is, if you planted a fruit tree, you would be prohibited to partake of the fruit for the first 3 years after you plant that tree. Similarly, again, in Chutz La'aretz, you would not be permitted to go ahead and intermingle different species of plant life as well. Again, we'll define the parameters. Rabbi Eliezer Omer, Af HaChadash. Rabbi Eliezer says this also applies to Chadash. Now we'll say Chadash, and this is actually going to be more tomorrow's sugya, which is a really great sugya. So what is Chadash? So remember again, in the world of grain, in the wide world of grain, so the way it works is that halacha l'maisa, anything that's planted after last Pesach, right, is called Chadash. So let's just chart this. So you have Pesach, for example, Pesach Tafshin Pei Gimel, Pesach 5783. So after Pesach 5783, I planted wheat, right? So now what happens? From Pesach 5783 until the bringing of the Omer in Pesach 5784, the carbon Omer was a barley offering brought on the second day of Yantiv. So grain planted after Pesach 5783 until the Omer is brought in Pesach 5784, that crop is called Chadash. After you bring the Omer 5784, that crop now becomes referred to as Yashan. That's the concept of chadash and yashan. So Rabbi Elazar says, even chadash. Now, we're going to see, there's going to be a major machlokes as to what exactly Rabbi Eliezer is saying. Right? Is he including chadash in the category of arla and kilayim? Is he putting it in a different category? That we'll see. Right now, we'll just translate the words. Rabbi Eliezer says, even chadash. Okay, we'll say, that's our Mishnah. Mikra Mishnah, you can tell, you can tell already, by a Mishnah like this, there is good stuff coming, right? A lot of fascinating discussion. So first, the Gemara begins. We both say Lamed Zayin Amadallah 37a, second line down from the top. The Gemara says, let's first go ahead and focus on definitions. So says the Gemara, "My tuluya umay she'ina tuluya." What does it mean when we're speaking about a mitzvah hatuluya? Most remember again, how would you translate the word tuluya? Tuluya means dependent on. What do you mean when you say a mitzvah dependent on the land versus a mitzvah that's not dependent on the land? My tuluya, my she'ina tuluya. So ilema tuluya d'ksiv be bia, v'she'ina tuluya d'lo ksiv be bia. So I'll say maybe tuluya means a mitzvah that the Torah discusses bia. We'll say what bia in this context means what? Entry into the land. So perhaps a mitzvah hataluya ba'aretz is a mitzvah in which when the Torah discusses the mitzvah, it's discussed in the context of arriving in Eretz Yisrael. Look at Rashi. Rashi says, "Tuluya d'chsiv be'biyah, shetlah hakasa be'biyas aretz kigon kisavo ki yevi'acha." See, that's what it means. So a mitzvah tuluya ba'aretz means a mitzvah that when you find it in the Torah, the way it's discussed is it's a mitzvah that occurs when you enter into the land, versus a mitzvah she'ina tuluya ba'aretz, so means a mitzvah she'ena tluya, a mitzvah that's not dependent on that, is a mitzvah where the Torah doesn't link the mitzvah to the coming into Eretz Yisrael. Here's the problem with that. Hari tefillin upeter chamar. I will say, when you take a look at the mitzvah of tefillin and the redemption of a firstborn donkey, t'chsiv be bia. I will say, for both of those mitzvahs, interestingly enough, the Torah discusses arriving in Eretz Yisrael. So it says, Rabbi Neuman, take a look at Rashi. Peter Chamar, Rashi says, "Ksiv behu v'haya ki yevi'acha beparshas kadeshli." So I'll say, interestingly enough, both Tefillin and Peter Chamar, the Torah uses lashon when you come to Eretz Yisrael. They both say, now clearly, what would you say, that those are mitzvahs hatuluyos ba'aretz? So it can't be that the definition of a mitzvah hatuluya ba'aretz means a mitzvah in which it's discussed in the context of coming into Eretz Yisrael. Because sometimes the Torah just speaks about mitzvahs in the context of coming into Eretz Yisrael, because coming into Eretz Yisrael represents becoming an autonomous, responsible nation. So rather, what does it mean? So the Gemara says, and yet we know, everyone agrees, the mitzvah Peter Chamar, of redeeming firstborn donkey, right, and tefillin apply both in Eretz Yisrael and outside of Eretz Yisrael. So what's the definition? So Amar Rav Yehuda. This is what it means to say, Kol mitzvos shehi chovas haguf noheges bein ba'aretz bein b'chutz la'aretz. So we'll see, here comes Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda says like this: a mitzvah, there are different types of mitzvahs. There's what's called a mitzvah, chovas haguf. Chovas haguf, it means a mitzvah that is a responsibility on the person. Literally, again, a mitzvah I perform with my body, chovas haguf, an obligation upon me. So ultimately, again, that applies in Eretz Yisrael and in Chutz La'aretz. Versus chovas karka. Let's say then you could have a mitzvah that really the mitzvah itself is on the land. Such a mitzvah like that, eino nohages ala ba'aretz. That type of mitzvah ultimately only applies in Eretz Yisrael. Take a look at Rashi for just a moment. Chovas haguf. Rashi says, Hainu eina tluya ba'aretz, eina muteles ala karka, v'lo al giduleha, ela al gufo shel adam kigon Shabbos, tefillin, avodas kochavim, peter chamar, mila arayos kiyotzeba. So we'll say here, so this is actually quite interesting. So Rabbi Yehuda says there are two different categories of mitzvos. There's what's called the chovas haguf and chovas karka. Chovas haguf means mitzvos incumbent upon the person. Literally, I will say there are mitzvos that I perform with my body versus mitzvos which are performed with the land. So, for example, tefillin. right? Again, Rashi's examples over here. Tefillin, bris milah, avodah zara, that's in the avera category. Peter chamar, right? These are chovas haguf, and ultimately, again, chovas haguf apply both in Eretz Yisrael and in Chutz La'aretz, versus chovas karka. So look at the next Rashi, chovas karka. Rashi says, shemu telas ala karka o gidulah. So these are examples of mitzvos that are upon the land or on that which grows from the land. Kigon trumas o maestros, shatruma meiser, chala, leket, shichacha, peah, shvius, shmita, right? Chadash, arla, kilayim. So, right, so again, we'll get into arla, kilayim in just a little bit in chadash. So we'll say, so these are our categories. Now, what I do want to share with you is something very interesting. So you have two different categories. So it's a very simple distinction. So you have Shemitah, right? Shemitah is on the land. Shumas and Maestros, on produce. Now, just to be clear, even those things that are quote-unquote chovas karka, they're still on me, right? In other words, these are my responsibilities to perform. But what it's really saying is the obligation of the mitzvah is only triggered by the land itself. It's not on the individual, it's triggered by the land. So two different categories of mitzvos. Chovas haguf and chovas karka. Chovas haguf, mitzvos that are incumbent upon the person himself, meaning he performs them with his body. Ultimately, again, those apply in Eretz Yisrael and Chutz La'aretz. Mitzvos that are only triggered by the land, those are only incumbent upon, those are only applied in Eretz Yisrael, not in Chutz La'aretz. Fine. So we'll say, how do we know to make this? How do we know to make this distinction? Says the Gemara, the Torah Banon. Eila chukim. So the Gemara quotes the pasuk. The pasuk is Eila chukim v'mishpatim asher tishmurun la'asos ba'aretz asher Hashem elokecha asher Hashem elokei avosecha asher Hashem elokei avosecha asher nasan Hashem elokei avosecha l'cha l'rishta kol hayamim ashertem chayim ala adamos. That's the pasuk now we're going to dissect. So watch this. Says the Gemara, Eila chukim. What are chukim? Eila hamidrashos. These refer to the halachos, ultimately, again, that Chazal learn out from drashas. So not necessarily mitzvahs that are explicitly written in a pasuk, but rather they'll learn that. V'mishpatim, what's that? Elu adinim. These are the halachos that are a bit more explicit. Asher tishmerun, zu mishnah. Ultimately, and say, so what's tishmerun? Tishmerun refers to the obligation to learn Torah. La'asos, ultimately, again, this refers to actions. Maisa, right? Ba'aretz. So when it says ba'aretz, yachol kol hamitzvos kulan lo yunogos ela ba'aretz. So there's an interesting havamina. You might have thought that all mitzvos only apply in Eretz Yisrael. I will say, so just by the way, just the fact that there's such even like a havamina like that is fascinating, right? I might have thought that where does Torah apply? Where does Klal Yisrael have Torah? In Eretz Yisrael. Right? The Gemara says, Talmud Omar, Kol Hayomim, Asher Atem Chayim Al Ha'adama. Then it says, Pasuk says, all the days in which you live on the earth. What does that mean? It will say, Al Adama. Adama means anywhere, which tells you that Torah is incumbent upon a person wherever they are. I will say again, I can't say enough, just the Havamin itself is quite overwhelming. Okay, fine. Nevertheless, Kol Yomim Yachol Yunogim Bein Baris Bein B'chutz La'aretz. So I'll say, if based on the phrase Kol Yomim, then I might have thought that all mitzvos apply, both in Eretz Yisrael and outside of Eretz Yisrael. Talmud Lomar Ba'aretz. Therefore, what the pasuk says Ba'aretz. So I'll say, so now what you have essentially are contradictory inferences from the pasuk. On one hand, the pasuk says Ba'aretz, which would have led me to think that what? Mitzvos only apply in Eretz Yisrael. Then it says Kol Yom Asher Atem Chayim Al Adamo, all the years in which you live on the earth, which would seem to indicate to me that what? That mitzvos apply anywhere and everywhere. So which one is it? Do mitzvos only apply in Eretz Yisrael, or do mitzvos apply everywhere? To which the Gemara says, Talmud Lomar Ba'aretz, Achashri b'hakasuv u'mi'et. So now that the Torah went ahead and had a riboy and a mi'ut, say u'lamad mimash sha'amar be'inyan. Let's look at the pasuk itself. So I'll say, what else does it say in this pasuk? And this is incredible. So I will say, the very next pasuk, the pasuk we just quoted from, Avela Chukim, that's Dvarim Perek Beis pasuk Aleph. The very next pasuk, Dvarim Perek Beis pasuk Beis, says, Abeid ta'abdun eskala makomos asher avdusham. I will say, then afterwards the pasuk says, destroy avodah zara. Now watch this. Says the Gemara. We'll say just like idolatry is unique. We'll say now what's the nature of idolatry? Or I should say, remember again, idolatry is in the Avera category, as we know. But what's unique about idolatry? How does one perform idolatry? With their body, right? With your person. So ma avodas kochav miyuchadesh chovas aguf v'noheges bein ba'aretz bein b'chutz la'aretz. Just like idolatry is unique, is that again? It's what we call chovas aguf. It's on the person. In other words, we both say the prohibition of idolatry is triggered ultimately again by personalistic physical activity, by something I do with my person, and it applies in Chutz La'aretz and in Eretz Yisrael. We create a paradigm from this. We also what we call the binyan av, a paradigm. Af kol shi chovas aguf noheges bein ba'aretz bein b'chutz la'aretz. So to again both say any mitzvah that is a chovas aguf applies in Eretz Yisrael and in Chutz La'aretz. So I both say this is really fascinating because I think even before coming into the daf today, all of us knew these categories, right? You could group mitzvahs in two basic categories: chovas haguf and chovas karka. There are mitzvahs that are dependent upon the individual, right? That again are incumbent upon my person. I perform with my person, with my body. And then there are other mitzvahs that are triggered by the land. So mitzvahs triggered by the land only apply in Eretz Yisrael, although we'll see some exceptions to that. Mitzvahs ultimately again incumbent upon my person or are performed with my body apply both in Eretz Yisrael and Chutz La'aretz. And I will say, so now we have the source for this. Where do we learn it out from? So we'll say once again, it's Devarim, Perek Yud Beis, Pasuk Aleph. So what do I have? So a pasuk that teaches me contradictory inferences. On one hand, the Torah says, perform the mitzvahs ba'aretz. But then it also says, which seems to indicate mitzvahs only apply in Eretz Yisrael. Then it says, Kol hayomim asher atem chayim al ha'adama. All the days in which you dwell on the earth. Which seems to indicate the word of mitzvahs apply everywhere. So which one is it? Let's look at the very next pasuk. What does the very next pasuk talk about? Avodah Zarah. And it tells you that Avodah Zarah ultimately again destroy Avodah Zarah. Don't worship Avodah Zarah. Now what the Gemara is noting is the juxtaposition of Avodah Zarah to the previous discussion. What's unique about Avodah Zarah? Avodah Zarah is a chovas haguf, right? In other words, it's a prohibition on the person and ultimately applies anywhere, right? Chutz La'aretz, Eretz Yisrael. That creates the paradigm. A chovas haguf, a mitzvah, ultimately again incumbent upon the individual, applies in Eretz Yisrael and in Chutz La'aretz. But a chovas karka, right, an obligation triggered by the land, only applies in Eretz Yisrael itself. Beautiful. That's the limud. So we'll say let's go back there. Chutz mina olav climb. So interestingly enough, right after we go ahead and we finish creating this rule, creating this paradigm, what do? Now we know the exceptions to it. Because we'll say, based on what we've learned before, what would we say about Arla and Kilayim? What was about Arla and Kilayim? Where do they apply? In Eretz Yisrael. Yet, again, the Mishnah said, Tanakama said, Chutz mina Arla ba'Kilayim. So says the Gemara, Ibai lehum. So we'll say, so fine. So actually, interestingly enough, the Gemara kind of bypasses that for just a little bit and actually goes to the end of the Mishnah. Again, we'll discuss why Arla and Kilayim are different. We're going to see why they're different. But we're now bypassing that, going to the end of the Mishnah. Rabbi Eliezer said, Af chadash, even chadash. So now the Gemara says, what is he saying? Rabbi Eliezer lekula palig or the chumra palig? Is Rabbi Eliezer coming to go ahead and be more mekel, more lenient than Tanakama, or is he coming to be more machmir? What exactly is it that he is saying? Watch this. L'chumra palig, maybe he's coming to be machmir, and he says like this: Vachi kamer Tanakama. Chutz mina arla o mina kilayim tehilchasa gimirila. Right, Tanakama says that ultimately, again, arla and kilayim ultimately are one is obligated in them in Chutz La'aretz, even though it would appear that they're chovas karka, and that's based on a halacha l'Moshe Misinai. Hilchasa gimirila. So halacha l'Moshe Misinai. So right, hilchasa gimirila. Avagav deigel meimar chovas karkahi aval chadash ba'aretz in b'chutz la'aretz lo. But the Tanakama would say, Chadash only applies in Eretz Yisrael. So in other words, the Tanakama will say, there's an exception for Arla and Kilayim, and we'll discuss the nature of that exception. We'll see why there is. But according to the Tanakama, Chadash, I should probably say, the prohibition to consume Chadash only applies in Eretz Yisrael, not in Chutz La'aretz. My time, what's the reason? Moshav la'ach Yerusha v'yeshiva mashma. So I will say the Torah when it talks about the prohibition of chadash uses the lashon of moshav. We'll say moshav means in your habitation. In your habitation. The Gemara is going to discuss in just a little bit that whenever you see the word moshav means that the mitzvah only applies after the conquering and settling of Eretz Yisrael. Okay, so we'll say that's the position of the Tanna Kama. As the Tanna Kama holds, Arla and Kilayim are an exception; they will apply in Chutz La'aretz, but Chadash does not. Va'asa Rabbi Eliezer lemeimar af Chadash noi bein baris bein Chutz La'aretz. And Rabbi Eliezer comes along and says no. Rabbi Eliezer disagrees and he says no. Chadash also applies in Chutz La'aretz. My time, what's the reason? Because Rabbi Eliezer understands Moshav b'chol makom sha'atem yoshvim. Because Rabbi Eliezer says the word Moshav means what? Anywhere you live. Anywhere you live. As such, the prohibition of Chadash will apply anywhere we live. So remember, what are we trying to figure out over here? We're trying to figure out what Rabbi Eliezer, how we understand his statement in relationship to the Tanna Kama. So first possibility is, Rabbi Eliezer is coming to be Machmir. Rabbi Eliezer is coming to be Machmir, he's coming to Machmir and say, Tanna Kama says, only Arla and Kilayim apply in Chutz La'aretz, but Chadash does not. And Rabbi Eliezer says, yes it does. Yes it does. Why? Because the word Moshav in your habitation means anywhere you live. Anywhere you live. Fine. Odilma, the other possibility is, L'kula Palik. Maybe Rabbi Eliezer is actually coming to be Mekel. How so? V'achi kamer tanakama chutz mina arla v'akilayim v'hilchos al-gemirila v'kol shekein chadash d'moshav kol makom sha'atem yoshvei mashma. Supposed to say, watch this. Maybe the halacha is like this. Maybe Tanakama is saying it's supposed to get ready for this. Tanakama is saying this. Arla and Kilayim apply in Chutz La'aretz, and that is a halacha l'Moshe Misinai. Certainly, Chadash applies in Chutz La'aretz. Why? Because by Chadash you find the word Moshav. What does Moshav mean? What does Moshav mean? Anywhere you live. So we'll say in this version here, the Tanakama doesn't even have to mention Chadash, because of course Chadash applies in Chutz La'aretz. And comes on Rabbi Eliezer l'meimar Chadash eino noig ela ba'aretz. Whereas Rabbi Eliezer is coming along and saying Chadash only applies in Eretz Yisrael. Why? The Moshav la'achar Yerusha v'yeshiva mashma. Because ultimately, again, the word Moshav means something only applies after Eretz Yisrael is conquered and settled. Conquered and settled. Umay af. And when he says af, when Rabbi Eliezer says af in the Mishnah, what does af mean? Akamaisa. Akamaisa means it's referencing back to the original part of the Mishnah, namely the mitzvos that are a chovas karka only apply in Eretz Yisrael. So we'll say, see, hear this? Two different ways to read Rabbi Eliezer, which essentially means two different ways to read the Tanakama. In version 1, the Tanakama is saying only Arla and Kilayim apply in Chutz La'aretz because it's halacha l'Moshe Misinai, which we haven't discussed, which we'll see. Right? Chadash, according to the Tanakama, doesn't apply in Chutz La'aretz. Why? Because by Chadash the Torah uses the word Moshav, and Moshav means only after the settling and conquering of the land, which means Chadash only applies in Eretz Yisrael. Rabbi Eliezer comes along to say, no, Chadash does apply in Chutz La'aretz as well, because the Torah uses the word Moshav. Moshav means wherever you live. That's version 1. So in version 1, Rabbi Eliezer is coming to be Machmir. In version 2, the Tanakama says, Arla and Kilayim apply in Chutz La'aretz, and of course Chadash applies in Chutz La'aretz. Of course it does. Why? Because the Torah uses the word Moshav, and Moshav means wherever you live. And Rabbi Eliezer is coming to say, no, Chadash does not apply in Chutz La'aretz. Chadash is part of the category of Chovas Karka, and Moshav means only something that applies after this conquering and settling of the land. So we'll say, so what is Rabbi Eliezer coming to say? Incredible. So let's analyze. We'll say, so Tashma, so we'll say we are now 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 11 lines up from the bottom. So Tashma, Dam Rabbaye, Man Tana de Palik Alei Rabbi Eliezer. Who is the Tana who argues on Rabbi Eliezer? Rabbi Shmuel, it's Rabbi Shmuel. We'll say, what did Rabbi Shmuel say? Tisanya, the Lamdecha, Shekamakom Shene'emar Bo Moshav, Eino Ela La'achar Yerusha V'yeshiva, Divrei Rabbi Shmuel. So we'll say Rabbi Shmuel holds that Allah Chalamayse, anytime the Torah uses the word Moshav in your habitation, ultimately, again, Moshav always means after Yerusha and Yeshiva, after the land is conquered, right, inhabited and divided. So Amar la Rabbi Akiva, Hare Shabbos Shene'emar Bo Moshavos, v'nohagas bein ba'aretz bein b'chutz la'aretz. I'll say, but 1 second, the Torah by Shabbos says, B'chomosh v'osechem, right? Lo sevaru ish b'chomosh v'osechem yom HaShabbos. And I will say, we know Shabbos applies everywhere. Shabbos doesn't just apply in Eretz. He says, what do you do with that? Amarli Shabbos kal v'chomer. Asya. Shabbos is learned from kal v'chomer. Ma mitzvos kalos nagos bein ba'aretz bein b'chutz la'aretz. So we'll say, quote unquote, more lenient mitzvahs ultimately again apply both in Eretz and Chutz La'aretz. Shabbos chamir l'kol shekein. Certainly Shabbos applies. So the Gemara says, I will say, now watch this. Now let's pause here for just a second. So I will say, remember again. So Abaye, Mida Amra Abaye, Man Tanam de Palagalei de Balaz, Rabbi Shimon. So I will say, so the fact that Abaye says that Rabbi Yishmael is the opinion who argues on Rabbi Eliezer. Right, Rabbi Elazar, sorry. Right, and I was saying, what does Rabbi Shmuel hold? Rabbi Shmuel holds that wherever the Torah uses the lashon of Moshav means what? Moshav means what? Something only applies after the conquering and settling of the land, right? Which means, Rabbi say that it must be that Rabbi Eliezer himself holds that Moshav means wherever you live. Wherever you live. Shmamina, Rabbi Eliezer l'chumra palig shmamina. So we'll say, now watch this. Now we just answer our question. So therefore it turns out that Rabbi Eliezer will say is of the opinion that Moshav means wherever you live. It applies wherever you live. As such, we'll say, how do you read the Mishnah? Here's how you read the Mishnah. Tanakama holds, Arla and Kilayim applying Chutz La'aretz. Why? Haloch l'Moshe Sinai. But the Tanakama holds, Chadash does not apply in Chutz La'aretz. Rabbi Eliezer holds, yes, it does. Why? Because ultimately, again, Rabbi Eliezer holds that the word Moshav means wherever you live. Since the Torah uses the word Moshav by Chadash, ultimately, again, halach l'maisa, it applies in Chutz. So therefore, I will say, Rabbi Eliezer is coming to be machmir. Tanakama holds Chadash doesn't apply in Chutz La'aretz. Rabbi Eliezer holds yes, does. By the way, I just want to point out to you, just to understand, this is such an important sugya. I will say, to this day, there are people who are makbid, there are people who are careful on Chadash, there are people who are not. So I will say, it always sounds like a strange thing. Makbid on Chadash, not makbid on Chadash. Tell me, are you makbid on Shabbos, not makbid on Shabbos, right? How do you go? Let's say, so it's always interesting. Let's say, so again, I just want to point out, we have a lot more to do, but this is it. This is the discussion. Does Chadash apply in Chutz La'aretz or not? So this is the machlokes. Tanakama says it does not. Moshav means only in Eretz Yisrael. Rabbi Eliezer, yes, it does. Moshav means wherever you live. So incredible. So let's go weiter. Umichti. So let's analyze a bit. Michti. Rabbi Shmuel Heichakai. We'll say, what does Rabbi Shmuel, when Rabbi Shmuel is talking about Moshav, what is he actually referring to? Anesachim. He's referring ultimately, I will say, to the obligation to bring wine libations. So I will say, B'nesachim, Bia on the base, B'nesachim, Bia Moshav Ksibu. I will say, by Nesachim is different because by wine libations, the Torah uses both the lashon of Bia and Moshav. Right? I will say, the Pasuk says, Dabra b'nei Yisrael v'amart aleim, Ki savo el eretz moshvo seichem. So I will say, by Nesachim, by wine libations, there's a double lashon. There's a double lashon of entry into the land and settling the land. Hakikama, this is what it means to say. L'lamed shekom makom shene'emar bia umoshav eino ela la'ach yerusha v'yeshiva d'Rabbi Shmuel. So we'll say ultimately again, what it means to say is that Allah Rabbi Shmuel is saying wherever the Torah says bia and moshav, entry and settling, that comes to teach you that halacha l'maisa, the mitzvah only applies after the land was conquered, divided, and settled. Iachi Amar Rabbi Akiva Hari Shabbos Shneimar B'Moshavos. They'll say, so the problem is Rabbi Akiva says like this. Rabbi Akiva says, now it happens to be okay. We'll come back if we have time. I want to talk to you about Nesachim in this moment. Let's just get through a little bit more. So Rabbi Akiva says, Rabbi Shmuel, here's the problem with your statement, right? So Rabbi Akiva wants to say wherever the Torah says Bia and Moshav, ultimately that means that the mitzvah only applies after the land is conquered and settled. What about Shabbos? What about Shabbos, where it says Moshavos? Where Amarle Shabbos Kavachomer. ultimately again, so Rabbi Shmuel says Shabbos is kal v'chomer. Right? If mitzvos kalos, if simpler mitzvos or easier mitzvos, more lenient mitzvos apply in chutz la'aretz, so only more machmir mitzvos apply as well. So namely, ana bia umoshav kamina. So I will say, instead of answering with kal v'chomer, why didn't Rabbi Shmuel say, Rabbi Akiva, I'm only talking about mitzvos where it says bia and moshav. Shabbos has moshav but doesn't have bia. So the Gemara says chada va'od kamarle. So Rabbi Shmuel was saying two things. Number one, chada da'ana bia moshav kamina. Number one, Rabbi Shmuel is saying, I'm only saying that mitzvahs only apply in Eretz Yisrael right after the conquering and settling, when the Torah says bia and moshav. Shabbos doesn't say that. Therefore, Shabbos applies everywhere. Furthermore, the Gemara is va'od the amrit hari Shabbos nar b'moshavos Shabbos kavachomeri. Fine. Shabbos says the Gemara. So Rabbi Shmuel was essentially advancing two reasons as to why Shabbos applies in chutz la'aretz. Reason number one is that Rabbi Shmuel says, I only hold that halacha l'maisa something is dependent on the land when it says bia and moshav. Shabbos has moshav, not bia. Furthermore, there's a kal v'chomer that says that Shabbos applies in chutz la'aretz as well. Shabbos say, what are Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Shmuel arguing about? Well, say this is incredible. They will say what they're arguing about was, were there wine libations in the desert? Right? You know again that there were karbanos in the desert. Were there nesachim? Ultimately, were there wine libations in the desert? Rabbi Shmuel Silber lo kirvu. Rabbi Shmuel says ultimately again. I will say Rabbi Shmuel's individuals. Right? There were no nesachim in the desert. Rashi says Rabbi Shmuel Silber lo kirvu nesachim amidbar. V'yafal gav dechsid b'miluim v'zeh shar tasal mizbeach u'ksid bein nesachim ba'olas hatamid b'karban sibrahu dahavu aval hayichidim. Lo neschayvu b'nesachim ela mibias haaretz ve'ilach la'achiru shaviyeshiva. So Rabbi Shmuel says like this. Rabbi Shmuel says, while there were wine libations brought as part of communal offerings, there were no wine libations brought as part of individual offerings in the deserts. That only began upon entry into the land. Right? The Gemara says, so lo kivru nesachim b'midbar. Rabbi Akiva savar kivru nesachim b'midbar. Rabbi Akiva says, no, there were wine libations often offered up even in the deserts. Shabbos said, that's the machlokes. Amra Abaye, here's the problem. This version of Rabbi Shmuel contradicts another version of Rabbi Shmuel. The time of Rabbi Shmuel we learned, Holov and Emru bios v'torah stam. Uparat lecha be'echad mehen. Shabbos said there are many times ultimately again where the word bia, right, entry, is used in the Torah stam. And ultimately, again, yet by one of them, one of them is more specific. I will say which one of them is more specific. Look at Rashi. So we'll say one time when there's Lashon of Bia entry, there's also more explicit Lashon of Yerishta. You will inherit it and you will settle it. So what does that teach us? So the Gemara says, so what does that teach us? Afkol la'achar Yerusha v'yeshiva. Shabbos say this. Rabbi Shmuel says like this. Normally, you find the lashon of kisavo entry into the land many times. One time, the Torah used the lashon of bia with Yerusha and yeshiva. What does that come to teach us? That every single time there's lashon of bia entry always means after conquering and settling. The idach mishum dahava melech will be korim shnei ksuvim abayim kechad. The other will say, no. A king, the mitzvah of a king, and the mitzvah of bikurim, they will say, are both mitzvahs that only apply after you enter and settle the land. But there are two concepts. And as we've seen before, we can't learn out, we'll say, a rule from two instances in which the Torah states the same principle. The other opinion will say, they're both. Why? Because of Rahman Melech, below Kasa Bikurim, had the Torah just written a king and not written Bikurim, Hava mina bikurim to come is hanila altar. I would have said ultimately again bikurim, you get benefit immediately upon entering the land and from the fruit, and therefore maybe Allah Kalamaisa, the mitzvah does apply immediately. The kasav bikurim, v'lo kasav melech, and I had just written bikurim and not melech. Hava mina melech tedarko lechabesh altar. A king who is necessary to lead the army to conquer. Maybe you appoint him immediately upon entering into the land. The other opinion would say, Nichtov Rachman Melech, V'lo Bai Bikurim. Just write king and don't worry about bikurim. Va'ana amina, and I would say, Uma melech delechabesh la'achir yushav yeshiva, just like a king who's necessary for conquering, but only applies after you conquer and settle the land. Bikurim l'kol shekin. Certainly bikurim only applies after the conquering and settling of the land. V'idach, the other opinion would say, if it would say that, hava mina mida dahavi achala, I would have looked at chala. I will say, look at Rashi, chala, da'kol modim shenischayvu ba miyad. You're obligated to separate chala as soon as you enter into the land. So kamash malon. V'hashta, the amrit chovas aguf. So we'll say, so fine. So stop here for just a moment. So we'll say, so again, that was a little bit just of a tangent with two different opinions of Rabbi Shmuel. But I will say, here's what we have. Just to be clear what we have. What we have is a fundamental machlokas Tanakama and Rabbi Eliezer about Chodesh. Here's what everybody agrees with. Right? It's always concerned what to agree with. What do we agree with? Here are the categories of mitzvos. Chovas aguf, which means mitzvos that you perform with your person, and therefore again apply chutz la'aretz Eretz Yisrael. Category 2, chovas karka, which are mitzvos that what? Right? So we'll say we're going to reform our lashon. It's not just that they're incumbent upon the land, because also I'll give you an example. Even Shemitah, which is the paradigmatic mitzvah tliya ba'aretz, Shemitah is on me. In other words, the mitzvah is on me. The better way to say chovas karka is mitzvos which are triggered by the land. Right? So if I don't have land, I have nothing to observe Shemitah with. If I don't have produce, I have nothing to give trumas and meisos from. So chovas karka means mitzvos triggered by the land. And where do those mitzvos apply? Where does those apply? Only in Eretz Yisrael. There's two exceptions. What are the two exceptions? Arla kilayim. Why? We don't know yet. We don't know yet. Sounds like halacha Moshe Sinai. Machlokes case, chadash. And what does the machlokes depend on? How you interpret the word, and this is going to be tomorrow, we're going to see this more precisely in tomorrow's daf, how you interpret the word moshav. Tanakama says moshav means b'chol makom sha'ata yoshev, wherever you live. Wherever you live. So wherever you are, there's a mitzvah chadash. Rabbi Eliezer will say, no, moshav means la'achar yerusha v'yeshiva, after the land is conquered. After the land is conquered, therefore chadash only applies in Eretz Yisrael. Fine. So we'll say, so now, we just introduced another opinion of Rabbi Shmuel. So we'll say, this actually is interesting. We should then open up another machlokes Rabbi Shmuel Rabbi Akiva. What's the machlokes? So we'll say, what's the machlokes? The machlokes ultimately, again, is were there nesachim, were there wine libations in the desert or not? Rabbi Shmuel says no. Rabbi Akiva says yes. And that kind of opened up a whole bunch of different stuff. Incredible. So we'll say, so let's go back to a little bit. So the Gemara says as follows. The Gemara says, what did we get up to? So we'll say, now that we say that a chovas aguf, okay, I have one more thing to say about a sachib, but okay, we'll just go back there for 1 minute. I have to tell you this before we daven. So Gemara says as follows. So we'll say, so now that we say that, right, chovas aguf, a mitzvah incumbent upon the person, applies in Eretz Yisrael and Chutz La'aretz, Moshe the Kasev Rachmana Gabi Shabbos Lamali. So why does the Torah use the lashon of Moshav by Shabbos? Right? Why use that lashon at all? B'chol Moshe Seichem. Tuish one doesn't this one is incredible. Istrich Salzait Chamina Hoilu Binyana Demodos Ksiva Tibai Kiddush Kimodos. But I might have thought that since Shabbos is written in the section of the Yom Tovim, I might have thought that maybe Shabbos needs a declaration just like Yom Tov. What does it mean about saying? How do you get a Yom Tov? What has to happen in order for Yom Tov to occur? Beis Din has to be Mekadesh the Chodesh. They have to sanctify the new month. And I will say, how does Beis Din sanctify the new month? They must make an active declaration of Mikudash. Right? They must make that declaration. I might have thought that because Shabbos ultimately is in the same section of the Yom Tovim, maybe it requires a declaration of, Shabbos, just like Yom Tov. Kamash Malon, no, the Gemara says, Kamash Malon, Moshvo Seichem. And Moshvo Seichem means you create Shabbos in your own homes. I.e., there does not need to be a declaration of Beis Din. We'll say, isn't that fascinating? That's what Moshvo Seichem means. Not only does Shabbos apply anywhere, we know Shabbos applies anywhere, but Moshvo Seichem means we don't need a declaration from Beis Din. Shabbos is something that occurs in the Rashi, Tibai Kiddush, Beis Din, Falo Nog Kiddush Elabiyu, the Kidamar. Good. So therefore, again, we'll say, Halacha L'maisa, Moshav means that Halacha L'maisa, you declare, you quote unquote, Shabbos doesn't need an official declaration from Beis Din, Rabbi Yusab Shinab. So just last minute we'll stop over here for today. I have to share with you a ridiculous medrash. So we'll say this machlokes. Did Nesachim apply in Eretz Yisrael, in Midbar or not? Midbar or not. So ultimately, again, there's the machlokes, Rabbi Shmuel, Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Shmuel says no. Rabbi Akiva says yes. So we'll say, ask the Medrash, where did they get wine for Nesachim in the desert? Where did they get wine for Nesachim in the desert? So there's different opinions in the Medrash. We'll get ready for this. Medrash and Shira Shirim, the Gemara says, Rabbi Levi Amar, min ha'eshkol, from the cluster of grapes that the Meraglim brought back from Eretz Yisrael. Right, the cluster of grapes that the Meraglim brought back, which was a Gezunta cluster, right? That gave them wine for the 40 years in the desert. Gave them wine 40 years in the desert. And I will say, is that not incredible? And what a fantastic Musar Haskell. That cluster of grapes was the source of the undoing of Klal Yisrael. Right? It was those very grapes that ultimately allowed the Meraglim to say, look at this. This is like Chernobyl over here. What's going on over here? It's ridiculous. It's crazy. It's terrible. Right? This fruit this doesn't represent bracha. This represents abnormality. It's too big. It's too much. It's too abnormal. That's what got everyone worked up and got everyone to rebel against Klal Yisrael. And yet, that very cluster is what fueled Nesachim for 4 decades. They will say, what's the Musar Haskell? The Musar Haskell is sometimes it's the very things that undo us. It's the very things that are our weaknesses. The very things that are the cause for our averos, that are the cause for our missteps and misdeeds in life, that become the very vehicles for our personalistic growth. I will say this is the concept of tshuva. The power. What's the power of tshuva? The power of tshuva is the ability to take my averos and learn from them. I know what my weaknesses are. I know the chinks in my armor. I know what I have to work on. I know the areas that need attention. I know the areas in which I am deficient. I know the areas in which I have to improve. And now that I know all of my weaknesses, and now that I know all of my misdeeds, now that I know exactly my Achilles heel, I now can work on those things. That undoing all of those misdeeds, because they've identified for me the areas that I have to work on, become the very source of my strength. My cluster of grapes could become my nesachim. The very things that led to my previous undoing could become my present sources of strength. Allow your eshkol, allow your grapes to become your nesachim. All right, we'll stop over here for today. Shkoyach.
Why do you think Rashi